The morning briefing at Bagram Airfield carried the weight of desperation. Intelligence chatter had been intercepted 47 minutes earlier, revealing a hostage situation in the Korangal Valley that would redefine everything the 82nd Airborne thought they knew about aerial warfare. The Taliban had captured 2 Navy SEALs during a reconnaissance mission gone wrong, and their location remained a mystery that satellite imagery couldn't penetrate. What made this crisis different wasn't just the lives at stake, but the pilot they'd chosen to lead the rescue mission. Captain Zara, Phantom, Caliph stood at the back of the briefing room, her weathered flight suit bearing patches that told stories most soldiers only heard in whispered legends. The jagged scar running from her left temple to her jawline caught the fluorescent light, a permanent reminder of the day she'd ejected from a burning F-16 over hostile territory and walked 43 miles to safety. Her call sign wasn't earned through bravado or battlefield humor like most pilots. It came from her uncanny ability to appear and disappear from enemy radar, slipping through defensive networks like smoke through fingers. The mission commander, Colonel Marcus Brennan, avoided her gaze as he outlined the operation. 3 previous rescue attempts had failed catastrophically, with 2 Blackhawks shot down and 7 casualties. The enemy had fortified themselves in a cave system that seemed impenetrable to conventional assault. Air support was limited by the mountainous terrain and the risk of collateral damage to the hostages. What they needed was precision, stealth, and someone desperate enough to attempt the impossible. "Phantom, you're leading the insertion," Brennan announced, his voice carrying the reluctance of a man who'd run out of options. The room fell silent, save for the distant rumble of helicopters preparing for morning patrols. Some faces showed skepticism, others outright doubt. Zara had been grounded for 3 months following a disciplinary hearing that had nothing to do with her flying ability and everything to do with her refusal to follow orders she deemed suicidal. She stepped forward, her boots echoing against the concrete floor. "What's the real intel, sir?" Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd survived more combat missions than most of the men in the room combined. "Because if we're doing this, we're doing it right." The briefing screen flickered to life, showing satellite imagery of the Korangal Valley. The terrain looked like broken glass, all sharp edges and impossible angles. Somewhere in that maze of rock and shadow, 2 Americans were waiting for rescue, and time was running out. Captain Zara Caliph had been flying combat missions since her 19th birthday, back when the brass still questioned whether women belonged in cockpits. She'd earned her wings through a combination of natural talent and stubborn determination that had carried her through flight school, advanced tactical training, and 3 combat deployments. Her service record read like a masterclass in aerial warfare, with commendations for actions that remained classified years after the fact. The scar on her face wasn't her only war wound. Shrapnel from that ejection had lodged in her left shoulder, causing chronic pain that she'd learned to ignore. The psychological scars ran deeper, invisible reminders of friends lost and missions that haunted her dreams. But what set Zara apart wasn't just her ability to fly through hell and come back alive. It was her understanding that every mission was personal, every life at stake was someone's son, daughter, or parent. Colonel Brennan pulled up tactical maps showing the enemy's defensive positions. "The caves are here, approximately 2 clicks northeast of the village. Intelligence suggests they're using a network of tunnels that connect to at least 3 different exits. We've identified anti-aircraft positions here, here, and here." He pointed to red marks scattered across the mountainside. "The hostages are being held in the main chamber, but we don't know exactly where." Zara studied the terrain with the intensity of someone whose life depended on understanding every detail. The valley was a natural fortress, surrounded by peaks that rose nearly 8,000 feet above sea level. The caves themselves were positioned to provide maximum defensive advantage, with clear lines of sight across the approach routes. Any rescue attempt would be flying into a meat grinder, which explained why the previous missions had failed so spectacularly. "What about the weather?" she asked, noticing the cloud formations visible in the satellite imagery. Weather in the Afghan mountains could change from clear to deadly in minutes, and she'd learned to read the signs that meteorologists often missed. Variable winds, possible afternoon thunderstorms, came the reply from the intelligence officer. Cloud ceiling dropping to 4,000 feet by 1400 hours. Zara nodded, already calculating flight paths and timing. The weather would actually work in their favor, providing cover for the approach. But it also meant they'd be flying blind through some of the most dangerous terrain in the world. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and they'd join the statistics of missions that never made it home. The room buzzed with nervous energy as the final details were hammered out. Zara would be flying a specially modified MH-60M Blackhawk, stripped of non-essential equipment to maximize speed and maneuverability. Her crew would consist of Staff Sergeant Miguel Bones Rodriguez as her co-pilot, a man she'd flown with before and trusted implicitly. The insertion team would be led by Lieutenant Colonel James Iron Mackenzie, a Special Forces operator whose reputation for getting impossible jobs done matched her own. As the briefing concluded, Zara caught sight of her reflection in the darkened window. The face looking back at her showed the wear of someone who'd been fighting wars for most of her adult life. But her eyes still held the fire that had carried her through every previous mission. Today would be different. Today, she wasn't just fighting for mission success or military objectives. Today, she was fighting for 2 American lives, and that made all the difference. The flight line at Bagram buzzed with pre-mission activity as dawn painted the Hindu Kush Mountains in shades of amber and gold. Zara conducted her pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision of someone who understood that attention to detail was the difference between life and death. Every rivet, every control surface, every mechanical system was scrutinized with the intensity of a surgeon preparing for a critical operation. Her Black Hawk, tail number 1520947, had been modified specifically for this type of mission. The standard troop seats had been removed to make room for fast-rope equipment and medical supplies. Additional fuel tanks had been installed to extend their range, and the aircraft had been fitted with the latest electronic warfare systems to counter the Taliban's increasingly sophisticated air defenses. Most importantly, the bird carried no markings that would identify it as American if it went down. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit after completing his own checks. "She's ready, Phantom," he reported, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived more combat flights than he cared to count. Bones was originally from San Antonio, a former Army mechanic who'd cross-trained to become one of the most skilled co-pilots in the Air Force. His nickname came from his uncanny ability to diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone, earning him the reputation of being able to hear the bones of any aircraft. The insertion team was making their final preparations nearby. Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie moved among his men with the easy authority of someone who'd led Special Forces operations across 3 continents. His team consisted of 8 operators, each one hand-picked for this mission. They carried equipment that most soldiers never saw, weapons that didn't officially exist, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing they were among the best at what they did. Zara climbed into the pilot's seat, her hands automatically finding the familiar controls. The cockpit of a Black Hawk had been her office for the better part of a decade, and she knew every switch, every gauge, every subtle vibration that indicated the aircraft's condition. As she ran through the startup checklist, muscle memory took over, allowing her mind to focus on the mission ahead. The radio crackled to life with the voice of the tower controller. "Phantom 01, you are cleared for departure. Winds are currently 090 at 15 knots, visibility unlimited. Good hunting." Zara felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied the beginning of every combat mission. But this time, something was different. The usual pre-flight nervousness was replaced by a cold determination that seemed to emanate from her core. 2 American lives hung in the balance, and failure was not an option. The flight to the target area would take them through some of the most dangerous airspace in Afghanistan. Intelligence reports indicated increased Taliban activity along their route, with multiple surface-to-air missile sites and radar installations that had been causing problems for coalition forces. But Zara had studied the terrain for hours, memorizing every ridge, every valley, every potential hiding spot that could provide cover during their approach. As the rotors spun up to takeoff speed, she thought about the hostages waiting in that cave. Navy SEALs were trained to endure capture, but they were also human beings with families, dreams, and futures that depended on her ability to navigate through what everyone agreed was a suicide mission. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a familiar burden, one she'd carried many times before. The Blackhawk lifted off into the morning sky, immediately banking toward the mountains. Below them, the sprawling expanse of Bagram airfield disappeared behind a curtain of dust and rotor wash. Ahead lay the most dangerous 100 miles of airspace in the world, and at the end of that journey, 2 Americans who had been counting the hours until rescue arrived. The flight path took them northeast through the Panjshir Valley, following a route that would keep them below enemy radar while providing maximum cover from the mountainous terrain. Zara flew with the precision of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of nap-of-the-earth navigation, skimming just above the rocky ground while maintaining airspeed that would allow for quick evasive maneuvers if they encountered hostile fire. The landscape below was a study in contrasts. Ancient villages clung to mountainsides like barnacles, their mud-brick walls blending seamlessly with the surrounding rock. Terraced fields carved into impossible slopes showed the determination of people who'd learned to coax life from the harshest environment on Earth. But scattered among these signs of civilization were the darker remnants of decades of war: burned-out vehicles, abandoned compounds, and the occasional crater that marked where ordnance had found its target. Bones monitored the radio chatter while keeping a close eye on their navigation systems. "Phantom, I'm picking up intermittent radar contacts bearing 270. Looks like they're trying to paint us, but the terrain is interfering with their lock." Zara adjusted their course slightly, using a ridgeline to mask their heat signature from any infrared detection systems. The enemy's air defenses had become increasingly sophisticated over the years, forcing pilots to adapt their tactics constantly. What had worked 6 months ago might get you killed today, and survival meant staying one step ahead of an enemy that learned from every engagement. The radio crackled with an encrypted transmission from headquarters. "Phantom 01, this is Overwatch. We have updated intelligence on the target area. Enemy activity has increased significantly in the past hour. They may be aware of your approach." Zara keyed her microphone. "Copy, Overwatch. Any change to the mission parameters?" "Negative, Phantom. You are still cleared hot. The hostage's condition is deteriorating, and this may be our last opportunity." The weight of those words settled over the aircraft like a shroud. This wasn't just another rescue mission. It was a last, desperate attempt to save 2 lives before it was too late. The stakes had just gotten higher, and the margin for error had disappeared completely. Behind her, Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie was briefing his team on the insertion plan. His voice carried the calm authority of someone who'd done this before, but Zara could hear the underlying tension. Everyone understood that they were flying into a trap, but sometimes the mission required accepting impossible odds. The mountains grew taller as they approached the target area, their peaks disappearing into clouds that looked increasingly ominous. Weather in the Afghan mountains could change from clear to deadly in minutes, and Zara could see signs of an approaching storm system that would complicate their already dangerous mission. As they crested the final ridge before the Korengal Valley, Zara caught her first glimpse of the target area. The caves were barely visible, carved into a cliff face that rose nearly vertical from the valley floor. Intelligence had been right about the defensive positions. She could see the telltale signs of anti-aircraft emplacements positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across any approach route. The Blackhawk descended into the valley, its rotor wash stirring up dust clouds that would announce their presence to anyone watching. But stealth was no longer an option. They were committed now, flying into the heart of enemy territory with nothing but skill, determination, and the desperate hope that they could reach the hostages before it was too late. The descent into the Korangal Valley felt like entering another world. The walls of rock rose on either side like the ramparts of some ancient fortress, their surfaces scarred by centuries of wind and weather. But Zara's attention was focused on the more recent scars, the ones left by rocket-propelled grenades and small arms fire from previous engagements. This place had seen more than its share of violence, and today would add another chapter to its bloody history. Bones called out radar contacts as they appeared on his scope. Multiple targets bearing various, looks like they're trying to coordinate a response. I'm seeing movement on the ridgelines, probably spotters with radios. The enemy response was faster than expected. Within minutes of entering the valley, muzzle flashes erupted from concealed positions along the cliff faces. Tracer rounds arced through the air like deadly fireworks, their bright streaks marking the paths of bullets that were passing uncomfortably close to the aircraft. Zara banked hard to the right, using the terrain to mask their position while maintaining their approach to the target area. The sound of bullets striking the fuselage was unmistakable, a sharp metallic ping that every combat pilot learned to fear. But the Black Hawk was built to take punishment, and its armor plating was designed to withstand small arms fire. What worried Zara more was the possibility of a lucky shot hitting something vital, or worse, the appearance of heavier weapons that could bring them down with a single hit. "Phantom, we have company," Rodriguez called out, his voice tight with concentration. "I'm seeing movement in the caves, looks like they're bringing up something big." Zara followed his gaze and saw the unmistakable outline of a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile being maneuvered into position. The weapon was Soviet-made, probably a SA-7 or one of its variants, and in the hands of someone who knew how to use it, it could turn their rescue mission into a catastrophe. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the missile operator would have a clear shot. The decision came instinctively, born from years of combat experience and an understanding that sometimes the only way out is through. Instead of pulling back to a safe distance, Zara pushed the aircraft into a diving attack, using the Black Hawk's speed and maneuverability to close the distance before the missile could be fired. The maneuver was dangerous, bringing them within range of every small arms weapon in the area, but it was their only chance. Machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions as the helicopter dove toward the cliff face. The distinctive chatter of AK-47s mixed with the heavier sound of a PKM machine gun, creating a symphony of violence that filled the valley. Zara felt the aircraft shudder as bullets found their mark, but the engines continued to run smooth, and the controls remained responsive. Behind her, Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie was coordinating with his team, preparing for the insertion that would determine the success or failure of their mission. His voice remained calm despite the chaos around them, a professional soldier doing his job under the worst possible circumstances. 30 seconds to insertion. Check your equipment and prepare for immediate deployment. The fast-stroke points were already prepared, thick nylon lines that would allow the Special Forces operators to descend rapidly to the ground. But first, they needed to find a suitable landing zone, and the terrain around the caves offered few options. Zara would need to hover the aircraft in position while under fire, maintaining stability long enough for 8 heavily armed men to slide down ropes into combat. The missile operator was still trying to acquire a lock when Zara spotted a small ledge about 50 meters from the cave entrance. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best they were going to get. She banked the aircraft hard to the left, using the cliff face to shield them from some of the ground fire while positioning for the insertion. "Bones, I need you to watch our 6," she called out, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "The minute those ropes go out, every fighter in the valley is going to try to put us down." Rodriguez acknowledged with a terse "copy," his hands moving across his instrument panel as he prepared to coordinate their defensive measures. The co-pilot's station in a Blackhawk wasn't just about navigation and communication. In combat, it became a vital part of the aircraft's survival system. As they approached the insertion point, Zara could see the cave entrance clearly for the first time. The opening was larger than the satellite imagery had suggested, probably big enough to hide a significant force. Intelligence estimates had suggested 30 to 40 Taliban fighters, but given the intensity of the defensive fire, she suspected the actual number was considerably higher. The aircraft settled into a hover about 20 feet above the ledge, its rotors creating a whirlwind of dust and debris that would provide some concealment for the insertion. But the position also made them a stationary target, and Zara knew they had perhaps 90 seconds before the concentrated fire would become too intense to maintain their position. The first rope deployed with a sharp crack, followed immediately by the second. Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie was the first man down, his boots hitting the rocky ledge with practiced precision. The rest of his team followed in rapid succession, each operator sliding down the rope with the fluid grace of someone who'd performed this maneuver countless times. Zara fought to maintain the aircraft's position as ground fire intensified around them. The sound of bullets striking the fuselage had become constant, a deadly percussion that accompanied the steady beat of the rotor blades. She could feel the aircraft's response becoming sluggish, probably indicating damage to one of the hydraulic systems, but the engines continued to run strong. "Last man down," came the call from the cabin, and Zara immediately began to pull away from the cliff face. The insertion was complete, but now came the hard part, keeping the aircraft airborne long enough to provide support for the rescue team, and hopefully to extract them along with the hostages when the mission was complete. The Black Hawk gained altitude as it moved away from the immediate danger zone, but Zara knew they weren't out of trouble yet. The enemy would be repositioning to counter their next move, and the longer they remained in the valley, the more organized the opposition would become. Time was working against them, and every second counted. The Special Forces team had disappeared into the cave system, their radio calls becoming intermittent as the rock walls interfered with communications. Zara orbited the valley at a safe distance, monitoring multiple radio frequencies while keeping watch for any sign of the shoulder-fired missiles that posed the greatest threat to their survival. The first indication that the rescue team had made contact came in the form of an explosion that echoed through the valley like thunder. Smoke poured from one of the cave entrances, followed by the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire. The battle for the hostages had begun, and Zara knew that her part in the mission was far from over. "Phantom, this is Iron," came the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie over the radio. "We have located the hostages, but they're in bad shape. We're going to need immediate medical evacuation." Zara acknowledged the transmission while scanning the valley for signs of additional enemy activity. The rescue team's success would depend on her ability to provide support and eventually extract them from what was rapidly becoming a very dangerous situation. But first, she needed to deal with the surface-to-air missile threat that was still somewhere in the cave system. The radio crackled with another transmission from the ground team. "Phantom, be advised, we have identified at least 2 SAM sites in the area. They're mobile and they're trying to get a lock. You might want to consider changing your flight pattern." Zara was already ahead of them, varying her altitude and heading to make it difficult for the missile operators to track her movement. The SA-7 was an effective weapon, but it required time to lock onto a target, and she had no intention of making their job any easier. As she maneuvered through the valley, her mind was already working on the extraction plan. Getting the team out would be even more difficult than the insertion, especially if they were carrying wounded hostages. The enemy would be expecting them to return to the same location, and they'd have had time to position additional weapons to cover the likely escape routes. The sound of the explosion had attracted attention from beyond the immediate area. Zara could see dust clouds on the horizon that indicated vehicles moving toward their position. Reinforcements were coming, and the window for a successful extraction was closing rapidly. But Captain Zara, Phantom, Caliph had been in situations like this before. She'd learned long ago that the most dangerous missions required a combination of skill, luck, and the willingness to take calculated risks that other pilots wouldn't consider. Today would test all of those abilities, and the lives of 2 American hostages hung in the balance. The radio came alive with urgent transmissions from the rescue team. "Phantom, we've got the hostages, but they're in critical condition. We need immediate extraction, and we need it now." Zara keyed her microphone. "Copy, Iron. I'm inbound to your position. Mark your location with smoke." As she banked the aircraft toward the cliff face, she could see the purple smoke grenade that would guide her to the extraction point. The enemy fire had intensified since the insertion, but she'd faced worse odds before. The difference today was that she wasn't just fighting for mission success. She was fighting to bring Americans home. The approach to the extraction point required flying through a gauntlet of enemy fire that seemed to come from every direction. Zara pushed the Blackhawk to its limits, using every technique she'd learned in a decade of combat flying. The aircraft responded despite the damage it had sustained, testament to both the skill of its pilot and the rugged construction that had made the Black Hawk legendary. As they neared the ledge where the rescue team was waiting, Zara could see the hostages for the first time. Both men were conscious but clearly in need of immediate medical attention. The rescue team had done their job, but now it was up to her to get everyone out alive. The extraction would be even more dangerous than the insertion. The enemy knew exactly where they were going, and they'd had time to position weapons to cover the likely escape routes. But Zara had dealt with worse situations before, and she wasn't about to let 2 American lives be lost on her watch. The Black Hawk settled into position above the ledge, its rotors creating a storm of dust and debris that provided some concealment from enemy fire. But the position also made them a stationary target, and Zara knew they had perhaps 60 seconds before the concentrated fire would become too intense to maintain their position. The first of the rescue team was already climbing aboard, helping to load the wounded hostages into the cabin. Zara could hear the medic working frantically to stabilize their conditions, his calm, professional voice providing a stark contrast to the chaos around them. Every second counted, and she fought to maintain the aircraft's position despite the increasing intensity of the ground fire. Bullets continued to strike the fuselage with increasing frequency, and Zara could feel the aircraft's response becoming more sluggish. Warning lights were beginning to appear on her instrument panel, indicating damage to various systems, but the engines continued to run strong and the controls remained responsive. "All aboard," came the call from the cabin, and Zara immediately began to pull away from the cliff face. The extraction was complete, but now came the most dangerous part of the mission: flying a damaged aircraft through hostile territory while carrying wounded men who needed immediate medical attention. The Black Hawk gained altitude as it moved away from the immediate danger zone, but the engine warning light that had just illuminated on her panel indicated that their troubles were far from over. The aircraft was bleeding hydraulic fluid, and one of the engines was running hot. They needed to get back to Bagram as quickly as possible, but the flight path would take them through the same dangerous airspace they'd navigated on the way in. Behind her, the medic was working frantically to stabilize the hostages' conditions. Both men had been severely beaten during their captivity, and one appeared to have suffered internal injuries that required immediate surgery. The success of the rescue mission would ultimately depend on her ability to get them to medical facilities before their conditions deteriorated further. The radio crackled with a transmission from headquarters. Phantom 01, this is Overwatch. We have medical personnel standing by at Bagram. What's your estimated time of arrival? Zara glanced at her instruments, calculating their speed and remaining fuel. Overwatch, this is Phantom. ETA is approximately 30 minutes, but be advised we have sustained damage and may need priority landing. The return flight would test every skill she developed as a combat pilot. The aircraft was handling differently due to the damage, requiring constant adjustments to maintain stable flight. But the hostages were aboard, the rescue team was complete, and they were heading home. The mission that everyone had called impossible was about to become another chapter in the legend of Captain Zara, Phantom, Caliph. The flight back to Bagram required threading through the same dangerous airspace they'd navigated on the way in, but now they were flying a damaged aircraft with wounded men aboard. Zara could feel the subtle changes in the Blackhawk's handling characteristics, the way it pulled slightly to the left, and the increased vibration that indicated stress on the airframe. But the engines continued to run strong, and the controls remained responsive enough to maintain controlled flight. Rodriguez monitored their systems while keeping watch for any sign of enemy activity. The return route would take them through areas where Taliban forces were known to operate, and their earlier presence in the valley had certainly been reported to enemy commanders. The possibility of running into additional resistance remained high, and a damaged aircraft would be particularly vulnerable to ground fire. Phantom, I'm showing decreasing hydraulic pressure in the primary system, Bones reported, his voice carrying the professional calm of someone who'd dealt with aircraft emergencies before. We're going to need to be careful with any aggressive maneuvering. Zara acknowledged the warning while adjusting their flight path to avoid known anti-aircraft positions. The loss of hydraulic pressure would make the aircraft more difficult to control, especially during landing, but it was a manageable problem as long as they didn't encounter any additional combat. Behind them, the medic continued working on the hostages, his efforts focused on stabilizing their conditions for the remainder of the flight. Both men were conscious but clearly in pain, and their injuries would require immediate surgery once they reached the medical facilities at Bagram. The success of the rescue mission would ultimately depend on the medical team's ability to save their lives. The radio crackled with updates from various units across the region. The rescue mission had attracted attention from multiple Taliban cells, and intelligence indicated that they were attempting to coordinate a response. Several roadblocks had been established along the routes leading to Bagram, and there were reports of increased activity around other coalition bases. As they approached the halfway point of their return flight, Zara spotted smoke rising from a village in the distance. The thick black columns suggested that something significant was burning, possibly indicating another engagement between coalition forces and Taliban fighters. The war in Afghanistan had become a complex web of actions and reactions, with every operation triggering responses that rippled across the region. Phantom, this is Overwatch, came the voice of the command center. We have intelligence suggesting possible enemy activity along your route. Be advised that we're tracking multiple vehicles moving toward your flight path. Zara altered course slightly, using the mountainous terrain to mask their approach while maintaining their heading toward Bagram. The additional distance would cost them fuel and time, but it was better than flying into an ambush. The hostages couldn't afford any additional delays, and she had no intention of letting them down. The landscape below showed the scars of decades of conflict. Abandoned villages dotted the mountainsides, their empty windows staring blindly at the sky. The people who had once lived there had either fled to safer areas or been caught up in the violence that had consumed their homeland. It was a reminder of what was at stake in missions like this one, not just the lives of individual soldiers, but the broader struggle for peace and stability in a region that had known too much war. Rodriguez called out a radar contact that appeared to be tracking their movement. "Phantom, I'm picking up what looks like a search radar, bearing 180. They're trying to paint us, but the signal is weak." Zara adjusted their altitude, using the terrain to break the radar lock while maintaining their course toward Bagram. The enemy's air defense network was becoming more sophisticated, but it was still vulnerable to the tactics she'd learned through years of combat flying. The key was to never present a predictable target, always staying one step ahead of the systems trying to track them. The medical situation in the cabin was becoming more urgent. The medic's voice carried increasing concern as he worked to stabilize the hostages' conditions. Both men had lost significant amounts of blood, and their injuries were more severe than initially apparent. Time was running out, and every minute of delay decreased their chances of survival. "Phantom, we need to get these men to surgery as soon as possible," the medic reported. "Their conditions are deteriorating faster than I can compensate for." Zara pushed the damaged aircraft to its limits, balancing the need for speed against the risk of further damage to their systems. The Blackhawk responded despite the mechanical problems, its engines providing the power needed to maintain their pace toward Bagram. But the warning lights on her instrument panel were multiplying, indicating that multiple systems were operating outside normal parameters. The radio crackled with a transmission from the tower at Bagram. "Phantom 01, this is Bagram Tower. We have emergency medical personnel standing by. You are cleared for priority approach to runway 09. Emergency equipment is positioned and ready." The familiar outline of Bagram Airfield appeared on the horizon, its runways and buildings offering the promise of safety and medical care for the wounded hostages. But Zara knew that landing would be the most dangerous part of the mission. The loss of hydraulic pressure would make the aircraft difficult to control during the approach, and any mistake could result in a crash that would undo everything they'd accomplished. As they began their approach to Bagram, Zara reflected on the mission that had brought them to this point. The rescue had succeeded despite odds that everyone had agreed were impossible. 2 American lives had been saved, and the Special Forces team had demonstrated once again that no mission was too dangerous when lives hung in the balance. The approach to Bagram required all of Zara's skill as a pilot. The damaged hydraulic system made the aircraft sluggish and difficult to control, requiring constant adjustments to maintain stable flight. But the runway was clearly visible ahead, and the emergency equipment was positioned to respond to any problems during landing. Rodriguez called out their altitude and airspeed as they descended toward the runway. 500 feet, airspeed 120. Hydraulic pressure is still dropping, but we're within acceptable parameters for landing. Zara fought to maintain control as the aircraft settled toward the runway. The Blackhawk touched down with a jarring impact that would normally have been unacceptable, but given the circumstances, it was a textbook landing. The emergency medical personnel were already running toward the aircraft before the rotors had stopped turning. The hostages were quickly transferred to waiting ambulances, their journey to the medical facilities beginning even as the rescue team was being debriefed. The mission had succeeded, but the cost had been high. The Black Hawk would require extensive repairs before it could fly again, and the intelligence gathered during the operation would need to be analyzed to prevent similar situations in the future. As Zara shut down the engines and completed her post-flight checklist, she reflected on the events of the day. The rescue mission had succeeded despite impossible odds, but it had also demonstrated the evolving nature of the conflict in Afghanistan. The enemy was becoming more sophisticated, their tactics more deadly, and future operations would need to account for these changes. The medal ceremony took place 3 weeks later in a hangar at Bagram Airfield. The entire 82nd Airborne Division had assembled to witness the presentation of commendations to the rescue team, but all eyes were on Captain Zara, Phantom, Caliph, as she stood at attention before the reviewing stand. Colonel Brennan read the citation for the Distinguished Flying Cross, his voice carrying across the assembled troops. For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight as pilot of an MH-60M Blackhawk helicopter during a combat rescue mission in the Korengal Valley, Afghanistan, on 15 October 2010. Captain Calith's exceptional flying skills and disregard for personal safety resulted in the successful rescue of 2 American hostages from a heavily fortified enemy position. The citation continued with details of the mission that had already become legend among the pilots and aircrew at Bagram. But what impressed the assembled troops most was not the official language of the commendation, but the quiet dignity with which Zara accepted the recognition. She had done what needed to be done, and no amount of ceremony could change the fact that 2 American lives had been saved. The hostages, Navy SEALs Petty Officer First Class Marcus Thompson and Petty Officer Second Class David Kim, had both survived their ordeal and were recovering at the military hospital in Landstuhl, Germany. Their injuries had been severe, but the quick action of the rescue team and the medical personnel at Bagram had saved their lives. They would both return to active duty, carrying with them the knowledge that their brothers-in-arms had not abandoned them. Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie and his Special Forces team also received commendations for their actions during the rescue. Their professionalism and courage under fire had been exemplary, and their successful extraction of the hostages from the cave system had required skills that few soldiers possessed. But they were quick to acknowledge that the success of the mission had depended on Zara's ability to get them to the target and extract them under impossible conditions. The ceremony concluded with the traditional flyover, a formation of Black Hawks that passed low over the assembled troops. As the aircraft disappeared into the distance, Zara thought about the mission that had brought them all together. The rescue in the Korengal Valley had been successful, but it was just one battle in a war that seemed to have no end. After the ceremony, she returned to her quarters to find a letter waiting for her. The envelope bore the seal of the Pentagon, and inside was a new set of orders. She was being transferred to a special operations unit, one that handled the most dangerous missions in the most dangerous places. It was both an honor and a burden, recognition of her skills, and a commitment to continue serving in the most challenging environments. That evening, she stood on the flight line watching the sunset paint the Hindu.